Hello, Mark. Thank you very much for joining us here at GTM Expertise. Appreciate your
Great.
time.
Thank you, Ben. Great to be on.
Awesome. So today we're going to talk a little bit about our experiences working in Asia Pacific, and you're going to share a little bit more about that. But before we get into that, it'd be great to get an understanding for people watching your experiences, going all the way back to how you started your career, what your journey's been like. That'd be really
Yeah.
helpful. Thanks.
I think a lot like you, I've come from a technical background. And so I used to write code for a living way back in the day and spent a long time working in an agency, building websites, building apps. And over time, I found that I was spending more and more time being customer facing and in workshops and scoping out projects and doing solution architecture and less time actually writing code. And I guess from there, the next logical step was into sales engineering. And that's where I kind of made the leap into the SaaS industry as a sales engineer. And that was incredibly eye-opening and fun and fast-paced, and kind of moving from being in a place where you are responsible for end-to-end delivery of a project to being responsible for making sure that your customer has the information to make the right decision and is then able to kind of go off and do it themselves. So it's a little bit lighter touch, in terms of you're across many projects, but without as much depth. And then, I ended up taking over the running of the Bright Cove ANZ team and, all account management and sales. I think there were about 24, 25 of us across the business. Small consulting team. We had support. We had marketing locally. And ultimately, I owned the number for the ANZ region for Bright Cove for a number of years. Just recently, I had the incredible privilege of starting the Vimeo operation in APAC. And on day one, there were 3 of us. And that grew very quickly up to nearly 40 people across Sydney and Singapore and covering all of APAC. So the way that I thought of it was everything from Kazakhstan to Tahiti was sort of our territory. But predominantly it was Australia, obviously, but Japan, Korea were incredibly important to us. India, Taiwan were all markets where we spent a lot of time.
Awesome. That's a great intro. Thanks, Mark. I think it's really important to understand the Asia Pacific definition there, because I think a lot of companies treat it in different ways, and we could talk for a long time about every single part of it. But we're both from a different part of what might be termed the Asia part of that Asia Pacific, and so certainly for me, I was fortunate enough to spend time living in Singapore, learning a lot, still learning a lot. What does APAC mean to you? And you mentioned in your Vimeo number what that means, but how do you describe that as a region to someone who perhaps is less familiar with the term APAC or the Asia Pacific region in general?
It does get treated in many different ways. Quite often, Japan will be broken off and will be seen as a distinct region in and of itself. There's no right way. I think it really depends on what your strategy is, what your resources are, and where you decide to kind of put your efforts. And we can talk a lot more about that. Before we get too deep, though, I just wanted to say, we're 2 white guys here who are about to make some big generalizations about the Asia and Pacific region. And I want to be really clear that we're coming from a place of intense admiration and fascination for the countries and the people of the region. There's so much diversity and such a rich history in science and philosophy, as well as in technology and trade, that probably goes back a lot further than people think. We learn a lot about European history and American history, but there's incredible depth. And, people talk about Westernization, and it's very easy to kind of look at that as being countries adopting Western models wholesale, and that's really not what happens on the ground. Like, what you see is countries in the region being very nimble and quick to adopt what they see as valuable, but then they'll layer it into their own experience, their own culture, and their own environment in really unique and interesting ways. And so, I think when I think of APAC, it's this incredible diversity, and that's what I love about it. That's what I find so interesting, and constantly learning is a huge part of that.
Totally. I love that. I mean, I think the concept of even grouping it as Asia Pacific, given the diversity, is really purely for geographic reasons rather than anything else. The diversity from country to country and even within countries is incredible, and certainly a privilege to be able to kind of work in these markets and learn from these diverse both business and cultural environments. I think it was a lot of fun for me when I was spending time there, and I know it's continuing fun for a lot of people. And we'd love to explore that a bit more. You know, let's break that down then. So often in a US SaaS driven company, you have these groups around the world. You've got your North America or Americas, you've got your Europe, potentially adding Middle East into there, and then you have this kind of, as you described, small region between Kazakhstan and Tahiti to group as one other region. Within that region, I would imagine you view, like me, there are what you might call tier one markets that might leverage a little bit more in terms of premium prices and premium sort of development in their business practices and things like that. How do you break that up sort of logically in your mind?
Look, I think you need to start with what is your product, what is your offering, and what is your product market fit in different parts of the region. There will be some products that will just naturally fit really well in different areas, and there will be some products where it will be incredibly difficult to sell into certain parts of the region. And one of the things with Vimeo was that Vimeo is actually blocked in Indonesia. They're blocked in Indonesia because of the public video hosting part of their business. And I guess you could say that Vimeo, being an organization that really values filmmaking and creativity and art, their standards around nudity don't quite align with the Indonesian government. And so, Vimeo.com is just blocked in Indonesia. So, there are things like that. The Great Firewall in China can present some barriers where it may make some fairly, otherwise obvious target markets actually incredibly difficult. Right. Another thing is language. Depending on how much your product utilizes language and how good your support is of various different languages and writing systems, it may make it easier or harder to enter different parts of the market. The last thing would be, how does your product scale? And are you doing many small deals, sort of at that consumer end of the spectrum, or are you doing very large enterprise deals, or is it really a premium product? That could guide you as well, because different parts of the region will be easier to tackle depending on the answers to those questions. But I think for me, Australia and Singapore seem to be the really logical first choices for many people. And I think it's important to remember that the Australian economy is significantly smaller than the economy of Texas. It is actually quite a small economy, whereas if you look at somewhere like Japan, it is in the top 3 or 4 economies globally, depending on how you count it.
Yep.
And so, one thing that I see a lot of people do is they think about APAC as being kind of Australia as a launch-off point. We can just take what we're doing there out to the region. And that doesn't necessarily work. It could work in some contexts. It'll get you a level of success, but to really succeed, you need to think more deeply than that. If you're able to operate in Japan, it's an incredible market, a very exciting place, very well connected. They're very early adopters of technology generally. Similarly with Korea, advanced economies, very innovative. India is another super exciting place that I think every organization needs to think about. The scale there is just phenomenal. I was looking the other day, there are nearly 4 times as many 4 and 5G subscribers in India than there are in the US. It's an incredibly connected population, very rapid adopters of technology, and probably much more advanced than many people give them credit for. But the scale is phenomenal. You can't do small things in India. You have to be ready to roll out to an enormous market. And there's very high expectations of the quality that you're going to deliver and the value that you're going to deliver. But you're held to exceptionally high standards in India. There's very little room to mess that up.
Yeah, totally. I remember going to India and I think it was Jio had just launched 4G. And whilst that's an advancement you'd expect in any country, the kicker there was that it was near enough free for everyone. And then suddenly, of course, the consumption of every type of media, video in particular, in this case, exploded overnight. And suddenly you had this economic situation, which was incredibly valuable for the media companies and content creators and vibrancy there, where connectivity now no longer was an issue, and you were getting net new internet users online almost in the tens of thousands
Yeah.
every day. That's just kind of it kind of challenges the rule book, I suppose, that some people might bring with them in how to attack a market, and it really gives you something to learn from, I think, in terms of how you then present your product and solution. And to your point, I think you need to decide, as a SaaS solution in particular, do you have a value there? Can you sort of provide a value to that and even within India, of course, top to bottom, it's incredibly diverse. Not only with you can't just say we're entering India. Which part of India are you going to create with the languages, the dialects? You really have to go in with a plan, and I think treating that with a huge amount of respect and scale is important. Not only as your product, but with personnel. So, talk to me a bit more about the personnel situation for you in terms of how you in-country personnel versus sort of what can be spoke kind of situation where you have this hub and everyone kind of flies off to go and service markets. Certainly from my experience, I think a lot of countries there in Asia Pacific value that face-to-face sort of experiences. How did you manage that in terms of which markets you might have deployed perhaps personnel in? And how do you kind of come up with that evaluation yourself? What are your criteria for that?
I think no matter what, if you're operating in the APAC region, you're going to spend a lot of time on a plane. That's just a fact of life, wherever you're based. But I do think if there's ever a case to have a decentralized team spread across the region, it's a fantastic example of where that can be super successful. Headquartered in even Singapore, which is, the crossroads of the world, it's a fairly decent flight to Japan. It's a fairly decent flight to India. It's a very decent flight to Australia or New Zealand. So, I think you can leverage having people spread across the region physically. And the advantage that comes with that quite often will be that you get people who have an understanding of the local language, the local culture, and can really appreciate some of the nuances. But yeah, I think that what you said about actually getting face-to-face is hugely important. I think there's a wariness, if not a skepticism, about vendors coming into the region and paying some lip service and then disappearing, right? And so it can be truly transformative to just go to a customer's office, have a meal with them, go to a conference and physically meet and spend time with people. It just really changes the nature of the conversation. And something else that I think is very, very effective is to get an exec from overseas, from outside the region, to come and visit the region, go do a road trip with them. I've had some just wonderful moments, having a CEO come to the region and being able to take them to some customers who don't get many CEOs from multinational companies coming in to visit them. It really transforms the relationship. People warm to it. They get a sense that they are truly valued and seen as individuals, and they will repay you in loyalty as well as a willingness to speak on your behalf and to put their hand up as a happy customer and partner. And I think, that's really the key to success in the region, is having people in the region who are willing to stand up and say, yep, I work with these guys, and, they might not be perfect, but, they've stood by me, they've been there, and they're good business with. That goes a very long way.
Yeah, I mean, if I reflect on some of those relationships that I made in and around, I suppose in a more, perhaps even in Singapore or in a more sort of transactional, highly corporate environments, it feels less perhaps authentic in terms of relationship. Whereas when I've traveled to, India, Taiwan, Thailand, where that human to human connection is far more, I guess, valued, I suppose. And I can remember the events that we sort of held and bringing all that knowledge together, being open to learning from the cultures and the experiences that they have locally, and then perhaps even bringing that back to the product teams and creating those localizations or whatever that is needed. It doesn't necessarily need a new product often, right? It's more just presenting the product in a different way. Perhaps in a workflow situation, maybe you're coming into something, an industry that's been going for 20 to 30 years, and it's just how that market does that workflow. You can make some minor tweaks there that can really go a long way. And that localization, both in terms of humans, but also product, can go a long way. How do you view that then in terms of, you could then make 40 localizations in 40 different countries? Obviously, the sort of age old will go where the money is often is the answer you might get from HQ. But how do you view that? Because there's just a lot of subtlety to that. I don't think it's about just going around and figuring out where the money might be. What's your sort of take on that?
I got a ton of thoughts about that. In many parts of the region, most parts of the region, English is accepted as the language of business. And so if you're talking about your contract being in English, your support documentation being in English, the UI being in English, your proposal being in English, that's generally not going to be a barrier in places from India to Malaysia to Singapore and many other parts of the region. But there's a key difference that if your product touches their end user, right? So we've both worked in the video space. What they really care about is that if people are then consuming that content for recreation and entertainment, they don't want it in English, right? Like there is a mental effort. Even though people are fairly fluent and comfortable in English, when they're relaxing, they want to have it in Tamil or Hindi or Baha'i. So, it's not even as simple as saying, okay, yeah, English is fine here. It's like fine here for these use cases. People will tolerate and accept it in these use cases. Now, the big exceptions there are Japan and Korea in particular. Taiwan is kind of up there with them, maybe a little bit more comfortable in English, but less than 10% of people in Japan describe themselves as being comfortable in English. And, put yourself in that situation where you're being asked to do business in a language that you're not comfortable in. Maybe you've got a smattering of it. Would you sign a $10,000 contract, right? Would you sign a $100,000 contract? Right? At a certain point, you're just like, no. So it puts a cap on the sort of business that you're going to be doing in places like Japan and Korea if you aren't end-to-end in the language, if your reps and account managers don't speak the language, if you don't have technical support in the language, if your contracts aren't in the language, potentially, right, in some situations. And that's not even talking about the product. I think that English is going to get you a certain way, but you can really unlock parts of the region by going beyond that. And it's particularly a big competitive advantage. Like if your competitors are not doing that, you've got it could well be worth your effort. In terms of personnel, I think having folks, if you choose, let's say you come up with 5 tier 1 countries, right? Or 5 tier 1 markets that are going to be your primary focus in the region. I think it makes sense to have staff who speak natively the language of those markets.
Yep.
That's very, very important. You can really struggle to penetrate any of those markets if you don't have native language skills. But then, that still leaves a huge part of the region uncovered if you're just sort of placing your bets in let's say, 3 to 5 countries. But that's where I think partners can be really important. And they can give you the ability to have a presence of sorts in the places where you're not actually physically putting your own resources. You can create some wonderful partnership relationships and, go out and visit them frequently and treat them like your presence on the ground in those kind of tier 2 markets. I think that's a really great approach.
Yeah, I was thinking that just as you were mentioning the kind of markets where you're not present, I think we could talk about channel partners for a long time too, but the benefit to having that partner completely unlocks what looks like an impenetrable market for you. And those partners don't necessarily look like on the outside. Let's say if you were evaluating them from their web presence or perhaps even the businesses they're in, they don't necessarily look like your stereotypical or archetype partner that might help you get your SaaS business into this market. However, because of their relationships, perhaps their history and what they've been doing in the past and all of these kind of things, for me, it was a massive unlock to have those people who can help navigate you. They set up all the appointments. You could try and go to a trip to Taiwan for 4 days and, you could bang your head against the wall trying to get your own meetings, but then you have a partner there and you've got 3 to 4 meetings a day for 4 days, dinners every night. That's just on that level, let alone just the sort of guidance on how to best present your solution locally, and sort of, you can emphasize this bit, perhaps de-emphasize this, is just so invaluable. And not least just having someone to be able to contract with and collect, from that basic level.
And
All of those things
procurement,
combined just make it so interesting.
A lot of that gets a lot easier by having someone on the ground that you can be doing business through. And quite often I find it is those smaller, more passionate partners, right? Like the partners that have 30 other vendors that they're working with, and you're kind of an afterthought for them. You're not going to get the same mileage out of it. But if you can find partners that are that right size where you can be a significant part of their business, they're going to really invest in you. And if you invest in them as well, it's really going to go well.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the operational sort of aspects to this, then let's take your regions. You're evaluating whether to come to APAC even, but in your case, you went from 0 to 40 people in a region, so that's a big journey. You're bringing people into what are you to expect in terms of like travel, how to the diligence and the kind of cadence in terms of visiting countries. Like, I think that's all really important to talk through, because you sort of no good just rocking up once every 6 months into a market and expecting to make progress. And so how did you operate that from an engagement point of view, like event cadence, things like that? Like what did that look like for you in the roles that you've had so far?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of diversity in that. When we were at Brightcove, it was very high touch, a dozen people at each customer company, very well, right? And we were in regular contact with a fairly large list. There were big relationships. They were very strategic. We were in the line of revenue for the customer. And so we were important to them as well as them being very important to us. And so, in that case, it was, we want to be meeting with each customer once a month, wherever they are in the region, right? So we're making sure that we get out there. Sometimes it was multiple people. Vimeo, particularly in the earlier days that I was there in the midst of COVID, was a lot more high velocity, transactional, smaller deals. There was less direct kind of engagement and deep learning and relationship forming with the customers. There were also lockdowns. Travel wasn't easy. Post-COVID, we really almost had to relearn how to travel and how to incorporate travel into our routine and into our go-to-market. But we did. And, what we went for was minimum once a quarter, every rep is doing a trip for a week to 10 days. That was account managers as well as AEs. Pick a geography, maybe hit 3 to 4 cities, come up with a list in each of those cities. Absolutely mandatory thing. Sit down with the partner, right? Make sure that if you're in Taiwan, even if you're an AM and your accounts are not through the partner, go do a lunch and learn at the partner, right? Go and show the love and spend some time with them. Give that value back to them of being physically present. But yeah, get out there and try and have as many high quality conversations as you can for that period. And each quarter you're targeting a different part of your territory, so that over 12 months you could pretty much get everywhere and meet all the key customers or key accounts. And that was very successful. Initially, I think partly because I had quite a young team, many had not really been in roles that required travel prior to COVID. Coming out of COVID, they're like, I don't get it. Like, why are we doing this? But very quickly, they saw the value because they saw the change in the relationships that they were having and the change in the conversations. Yeah. There's some parts of the region where it's very hard to just get a customer or a prospect to put their camera on in a Zoom call, right?
Yep.
So, it may feel quite distant, but when you go and visit their office, you're amazed that, they're bringing tea, and the 40-minute meeting that you had lined up ends up going for 2 hours, and they're walking around the office and introducing you to everyone. And you feel like a celebrity and you feel really welcomed. And from that point onwards, you have an entirely different relationship with them. So It's really that is the value of traveling. You touched on this before, but people will tell you things in person and give you this insight into their business, their pain points, their hopes and their goals that they won't over email or over a Zoom call. And I think it's probably true everywhere in the world, but it seems to be particularly true in APAC.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're touching on sort of human interactions there. And I really think some of the success that we had, or where it was more successful, was around just doing what you said you're going to do, and don't ever not deliver that, and do it as fast, do it responsive and comprehensive. And if you think about just mapping it to your competition, we're assuming here everyone we're talking to here has got some competition. Is very likely they do, and a lot of that competition can be local too, right? It can be a local vendor who's doing a local job in a similar market to you. So you've got all of these sort of dynamics with that, but simply being kind of the fastest and most comprehensive. And if someone says, I need you here next Tuesday, you get on a plane and you go, no questions asked, it just goes a long way. And I think that is just a human thing. And I think you can map that to any part of your life too, in terms of just being a good person, right? But it does go a long way. And it really I can't emphasize that enough, that it perhaps is less around sort of very firm or traditional qualification methods about where the opportunities might be and what stage they're at and things like that. It's like, I think if you get on a plane, you'll very much understand a lot more. And like you say, you learn that information tenfold because you're in person and you're feeling it and you're on the ground. And certainly if you have international competition again and they're not doing that, then it kind of matters a little less where your product fits in the evaluation criteria at that point, right? I think a lot of people want someone to be there, to show face, and to have that capability to do what they do, not necessarily features and functions that you may think or what the evaluation criteria are in your industry. I think that's really important.
It's hugely important. It's that trust. And trust and respect are so huge in the region. And I mean, any global SaaS vendor can bring up a Nike case study, right? They can bring up these globally recognized brands that they're working with, these amazing data points. And I think there's almost a banner blindness that people get. It's just like, okay, whatever, I'm not impressed by that anymore, right? But a local story will cut through in a very different way and much more, it'll resonate a lot more powerfully, I find. And that sort of ties back into another thing, which is, I think, maybe a controversial opinion. I think that locally produced marketing assets, whether it's a webinar or a LinkedIn campaign, even if the production values are not at the same level as you would see in the global campaigns coming out of HQ, will cut through a lot more effectively, right? And it's appreciated. And I think it's sometimes difficult to persuade a marketing department from headquarters who want everything to look amazing, that no, actually, like, authentic and local is more important, right? And it's actually going to be taken to heart more in the region than a Super Bowl commercial that's just being rerun, out of time zone.
Totally. Before we finish, I'd like to touch a little bit on summarizing, maybe not the common mistakes, but maybe your advice for someone who's evaluating the APAC region and the sort of major things to take into account. We could talk definitely for many hours on this region, and I would love to. But I think thinking back before I visited the region, and then having spent a long time in the region, and then what you learn in that process, they're just worlds away in terms of what you have in your head and what you're looking at. So let's picture yourself, and you've not really traveled to the region. You've either been tasked with expanding into the region, or you're thinking about expanding into the region. What are those like real musts that you would advise someone to think about and put on the table initially as they start to make that journey?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to look very carefully at where you're going to place your bets, where you're going to put your resources, which markets you're going to try and win in. I think it's very, very tempting to start with Australia because it looks like the US and Europe in many ways. And I'm a proud Australian. Often, I think that you could be missing opportunities by taking that sort of approach. It's in some ways easy to just kind of take the cookie cutter approach, take the one size all fits all approach. Here's what's worked for us in the US. Here's what's worked for us in Western Europe. I'm going to launch that in Australia, and it will work relatively well, but that's not how you're going to be wildly successful in APAC. You can't do a one size fits all. So pick Australia, Singapore, plus a handful of other geographies that you want to invest in. And then really think about the strategy in each of those markets separately. And there may be some similarities and overlaps, but there's going to be a lot of difference as well. And it doesn't have to be perfect, like don't let yourself be held back because you can't get every marketing asset translated. You can't get every little thing. The ones that you do get translated are, 10x the value because, they are in the market. So look at what are the key things that you're going to put the effort into localizing and translating, and do that for those key markets. Find great partners for the other areas and really show a lot of love. And yeah, I think that's crucial. Turn up. And, I think this is the same with many parts of life, but, turn up for your partners, turn up for your customers, get on a plane, get out there, go to meet them where they are, go to conferences, be curious, and always leave an extra hour between meetings, because some of those meetings are going to turn into really wonderful meetings, and you're going to not want to be looking at your watch and trying to duck out the door. And yeah, lastly, I think, don't get wedded to the idea of centralizing your operation in one physical location. Like, it's not that important to have a physical Singapore office at the expense of having people on the ground in India, in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand. So yeah.
Wonderful, Matt. That was great. Look, I really appreciate you sharing your experience and expertise here with us. We value the experience lived, and hopefully folks who are watching this will pick up some great tips on how to attack the region if they're in that market or already there and are looking to expand. So really appreciate your time. We'd love to have you here again. And thanks for sharing.
Thanks so much, Ben.